Our story comes alive within these pages, for every time and place throughout the ages. God speaks and is heard, and the enduring word calls us to care for our world as we share the love that can set creation free. Restoring the earth to wholeness, peace, and harmony. Let the songs of the water, land, and sky resound, 'cause together we're all bound within these pages. There's always new life to be found.
Welcome back to the Green Lectionary Podcast, a production of Creation Justice Ministries. The Green Lectionary is a conversation on Scripture through the lens of creation justice. My name is Derek Weston, Director of Theological Education and Formation at Creation Justice Ministries. June is Ocean Month, and we've decided to do something a little different for the podcast. In this two-part series, you will hear voices of people who deeply care about the ocean and deeply love the church. They are ministers and laypeople, scientists and enthusiasts, all sharing their joy around God's marine creation. We've centered our conversations around 4 questions. When have you experienced God at the ocean? What can the ocean teach us about faith? What biblical text would you use to preach about the ocean? And finally, why should preachers talk about the ocean this month? In part 1, you'll hear from Rachel G. Jordan, author of the newly released Does the Ocean Have a Soul? Robert Sluka, a scientist with A Rocha International. Blair Nelsen, executive director of WaterSpirit, a spiritual ecology nonprofit. And Dan Vermeer, a faculty member of Duke University. Before we begin, a quick announcement to let you all know that we are taking applications for our next Eco-Preacher cohort. Eco-Preacher is a collaboration between Creation Justice Ministries, the BTS Center, and Lexington Theological Seminary, in which we host a year-long online program of monthly gatherings for preachers to learn, explore, and feel accompanied on their journey of preaching in a climate-changed world. You can learn more about this program and apply at creationjustice.org/ecopreacher. Join us now as we explore preaching in Ocean Month.
So my name is Rachel G. Jordan. I am a professional marine biologist specialized in coral biology and a lay theologian and devoted Christian. I also am a storyteller. I love having conversations with people about the relationship between science and faith, and connecting with people online is one of the coolest ways I've gotten to do that. I'm really active on Instagram, and you can find me at racheljordan.com. When I was young, I felt like the ocean was this epitome of wilderness, just wild chaos that was obviously so full of creatures and just really interesting. And because I was little, I didn't have the best accessibility to it. I was still learning to swim, and it was a dangerous place. And that was some of my first experience of it. But the element of mystery, of knowing that there was so much out there to explore and discover, reminds me a lot of what it was like to grow up in my faith from childhood into adulthood as I matured as a Christian. And the mystery element of it, and even the feeling of potential danger along the way, of doubting and struggling and wrestling with concepts, but always knowing that there's something more to discover. The ocean for me, in many ways, it's both literal as a marine biologist, but metaphorical for my faith, in the sense that I've traveled parallel paths with both my pursuit of marine biology and my pursuit of God. So that's what the ocean means for me. But as a scuba diver, as a professional marine biologist, I have really special access to the ocean now. I can be absolutely immersed in it. I get to see coral reefs and undersea creatures that most people don't get the chance to see. It's incredibly special. I've looked up from treating diseased corals before, and there's a giant loggerhead sea turtle staring me down. And I've gotten to, do coral genotype sampling. And while I'm in the midst of doing that, I realized that there's a large, friendly red grouper who's been following me for the whole dive and just watching what I'm doing. Or I've gotten to befriend a really sweet seahorse working in an aquarium. So these experiences, getting to connect with creation in a really personal, immersive way, again, you can look at it metaphorically, but I think it's one of the ways that I access God. It's one of the ways that I experience His presence and His calling on my life to be doing this immersive ocean work is one of the ways that I can praise Him, I can honor Him, I can serve Him by stewarding, by protecting the world that He's made. It's incredibly special to get to be a part of. I think the ocean has what creation as a whole has to teach us about faith. I think anything that God has made was designed with the intent of helping the rest of creation better understand God's character. So we as human beings can witness creation, participate in it, be a part of it, serve and protect it. And our engagement with these things can better inform our understanding of who God is. There's a very direct connection between ecology and theology. And when we study these ecological relationships and then ask the theological question, the spiritual question, what does this science, what does this concept, what does this experience I've had in nature reveal about who God is, who God's made me to be, the rest of creation, and where everything's heading? When we start to ask those questions, I think we get to engage with God on a really personal but also universal level of understanding our integration with everything and God's overlaying power and affection over everything that He's made. What immediately comes to mind for me are the Psalms because there's
Mm.
so many references to the ocean. But then you also could, like, my favorite biblical epiphany I've had related to the ocean was connecting Genesis to Revelation. So when you look at
Mm.
Genesis 1, 2, 3, the creation account, but specifically looking at the role that water plays in those passages, how it's mentioned and sort of the ongoing analysis of how is this, how is the emphasis of the water in these passages symbolic versus potentially literal? And then doing the same thing with Revelation, especially when you get to the end of
Mm.
Revelation, chapters, 19, 20, 21. There's this verse in Revelation, I believe it's in chapter 21, that says, the sea will be no more. And as a marine biologist, people have asked me very specifically, Rachel, what do you do with that verse? God's basically telling you, hey, there's going to be no more ocean. My interpretation of that passage is primarily symbolic, partly because we see the presence of water pretty much right after that
Mm.
verse, where there's this description of what I picture as a river of, clear as crystal flowing from the throne of God. And then this description of the tree of life on either side of the river, and the leaves will be for the healing of the nations. And there's this ecology that is described that is thriving and integrated and biodiverse. It causes me to ask questions like, what kinds of creatures might we expect to be able to see in heaven? And I think we get some inspiration for that from the beings that are described in those passages. But I think the discussion of the role that the ocean plays in the Bible, you see it at the beginning, Genesis, you see it at the end, Revelation, you see it threaded throughout, many times used as symbolism for emphasizing God's power, His majesty. But as we get a better understanding of how the ancients who wrote the biblical text interpreted the ocean, how dangerous and wild it was to them, how chaotic and disorderly they viewed it, we get a better understanding of the role that the ocean plays in the Bible throughout the whole thing. So I would, if I could preach on anything Bible-wise related to the ocean, I would be doing a really fun analysis of Genesis, Revelation, and the role that the Bible plays between those two books, because I'll be very excited to see what God's restored creation looks like. And if I can't help but think, if the ocean is this marvelous now in a fallen world, if there's this much to discover and explore, I can't even fathom what it will be like when it's fully restored the way God
Mm,
intends for it to be. I would hesitate to say that any particular topic should be preached on in the sense that it gets the emphasis.
mm,
I think if you're choosing to integrate talking about the ocean, make sure Jesus is present, make
mm,
sure God is present, the Holy Spirit, like that is the center. But examining the relationship between God and his creation, examining God's use of the ocean in his creation, even before he'd created, there appears to have been water that God was hovering over in the beginning. How does that work? There's a lot of room for discussion between God's relationship with this particular aspect of his created world. And that is something that I I think it's a missed opportunity almost. I have yet to hear a sermon about this kind of thing. I have had the privilege of attending churches that sing a lot of worship songs that reference the ocean, that I've even gotten to attend some beachside services where, you're getting to look out and as you're worshiping God, as you're engaging in communion, as you're listening to biblical teaching, you're getting to see the waves coming up onto the shore. I've had that incredible experience, but I think it's pretty rare to experience a sermon that actually addresses the relationship of God to the ocean in that particular way, and then how humans connect that as well. Um, so I guess I would urge people, if you're looking for a topic that has not really been done much before, this is a really interesting one. And there's a lot of missed potential in terms of all the different biblical passages that reference the ocean. There's a lot of things you could potentially talk about. So the ocean has a lot to teach us about God's character, just as any other aspect of creation. But we as land-based beings tend to be biased towards talking about land-based ecosystems when we talk about creation. But the ocean covers 71% of our planet, and most of it is unexplored in terms of volume. I think only something like 25% of the seafloor has been mapped.
mm,
There's a whole lot left to it that we have not yet found. There's new species being constantly discovered, all sorts of fascinating research exploring new regions of our planet. These are really cool things, and everything that God has created has the potential to teach us more about Him. So I don't want us to miss out on better understanding God by ignoring a particular aspect of His world.
Hello, I'm Dr. Robert Sluka. I work with A Rocha, a Christian conservation organization, and I lead their global marine conservation program. I found myself staring into the face of a barracuda as large as myself. I knew I had the best job in the world at that point, but I didn't realize how good it was. Nor did I have words to express what this encounter with a fellow creature meant to me as a whole person. That would come many years later, and after much study, reflection, and a whole cast of interesting characters who gave of their time, knowledge, and experience so that I could be whole. The day of the barracuda encounter was a perfect marine biology day. The water was a shade of turquoise that is only found in tropical coral reef ecosystems. The sun was shining, and we were traveling in a small boat from our liveaboard dive boat to the study site. My fellow lab mate Mark Chapone and I were buddies together. The idea being that you always dive with another person for safety. Yet we were so comfortable with each other and being underwater that we parted ways and left for our respected tasks. He to document all the creatures and plants growing on the reef, and me, well, to count fish, of course. We could almost have done our work from the boat, the water was so clear. Swimming amongst the beauty of that place, we headed towards the point where the flat reef took a distinct 90-degree downward turn and became a wall. The first dive of the day is usually the deepest, and that was the case that day. I was looking for grouper, a type of tropical and subtropical fish targeted by fishers for its size, taste, and value. I headed over the wall and began to do my survey, hanging suspended over deep water that makes up the tongue of the ocean, a deep trench at the edge of the Exuma Park. That is when I noticed something noticing me. Clipboard laden with underwater paper and pencil in hand, I saw it far below. First it was just a shadow, perhaps even imagination, with the deep blue weighing on my mind. But then it began to grow, and I realized that something was traveling towards me. It grew bigger, and then before I could recognize it, shot past my head towards the surface. I looked up, and it was staring back at me, right above my head, the barracuda. If you haven't seen one of these underwater, you may have either an exaggerated view of the danger I was in, or be wondering why I was even concerned. Circumstances often make the experience. The fish was about as big as I am, and I am 6'5" tall. Barracudas have very large eyes and a pointed mouth that is full of big teeth. Fish breathe in water through their mouths, passing it across their gills, held behind gill slits in their head, extracting precious oxygen. This, when combined with the aforementioned big teeth, results in a natural state of this fish appearing menacing. We looked at each other for quite some time, the barracuda examining me and I examining her. It could be him, of course. At that time, I remember being grateful for the experience and seeing the beauty and worth in this animal neighbor. Grateful that I was living a life that would, hopefully, and eventually result in the protection of this creature and others like her. However, some of the language I just used to write those sentences was not a part of the original experience, but was imported and superimposed onto the experience afterwards. I do remember being grateful, but I also know that I would not have thought of that fish as her or neighbor. Possibly not even as a creature, certainly not a fellow creature. This theological language to describe that experience came much later in life, in fact 10 or 15 years later and in another world. To me, this is one of the things that has helped me to connect with God through the ocean, is actually learning to have a language to describe those kinds of experiences, using words like creature and neighbor to describe a barracuda is biblical, but at the time, the way I had thought of my faith was very dichotomous, dualistic. And so I think one of the ways in which now I'm able to connect with God is by applying theological language to the things that I'm seeing. At our research site in Kenya, the Field Study Center called Mwamba, there is a creature that lives offshore called the Halavi guitarfish. And if you imagine this creature as something like a shark that has had a collision with a stingray, you can imagine the animal. It's got a flattened head, but a shark-like back body. The thing about this creature, it is an elasmobranch, so it's part of the shark and ray family, actually technically a ray. And it's critically endangered according to the IUCN Red List. So this is a scientific way of categorizing how endangered different species are based on their populations and their trends. But I think the thing about this animal that's very interesting and that it occurs in this place is that sort of creativity, the beauty of this animal. It's about a 2-meter long or 6-foot long animal. It swims throughout these marine parks in East Africa. And there are very few left. It's critically endangered, one step away from extinction. I think a creature like this shows to me God's creativity, and especially God's otherness. We have to, in order to study this animal in Kenya, at our A Rocha's Field Study Center, we need to use scuba diving. We put on a mask and snorkel and sometimes tank and a regulator in order to be able to go underwater. We have to be very careful about the time we spend and the depth, because it's not an environment that we're in. There's this otherness about entering into the ocean. And many of the creatures that are in the ocean, like the Halavi guitarfish, are so different from us, live such different lives. And so the ocean, to me, is a place both of God's creativity, but also reminding me that God is other, is distinct, and we enter into His presence with trepidation, but also with joy, with expectation, and the ocean is a great place to experience that. Sometimes I get a chance to preach about the ocean and its connection with my faith. Some of the verses that I do like to use often are Psalm 104, particularly verses 24 to 30. This describes how God is looking after all of his creation, and including making a creature called Leviathan. And Psalm 104 talks about Leviathan frolicking in the ocean. And I think it's a great example, again, of a non-anthropocentric, a non-human-centered way of looking at the ocean, of looking at God's world. It's not made for us. It's God's. And this animal, Leviathan, whatever it is made to frolic there. And God seems to take joy in that creature. And it's independent of humanity. Its existence, its life, God's joy in it isn't dependent upon it being useful to human beings. In fact, in other places, Leviathan is described as being a dangerous animal to human, like in the end of Job. So I think this is really critical for challenging our human-centeredness. Another set of verses that I find really valuable is Revelation 5, 11 to 14. This is a picture of God's throne room. And we see in that picture that all creatures are before God, praising him, singing very similar, almost the same song that humans sing, and that includes creatures that are under the water. So it's a sign and a promise that the future, the new creation, includes the ocean, includes those creatures that are under the water. And so part of what we need to do is live into the new creation and help those creatures to flourish, help them to praise God now. And how does a crab, for example, praise God? Well, by being a crab in all its crabbiness. And the exciting thing is this is where science helps us to love God and love our neighbor. It helps us to understand what does it mean to be a crab. And so we can understand scientifically what it means for a crab to flourish. And when it's doing that, it's glorifying God. It's foreshadowing that new creation that we see in Revelation. I think there's a lot of great reasons to preach about the ocean. The upcoming summer, many people taking trips to the ocean. It's a chance to help them connect with God in a very special way. Also, to remember that 71% of the planet's surface is ocean. And actually, if you add up all the space, all the volume of planet Earth where creatures can live, 99% and more of that is actually salt water. So God seems to have a particular love of the ocean, has made most of life on Earth actually oceanic. And if God delights in it that much, so should we. I think, too, the ocean is particularly a place of power, where we see God's strength. It's where we see joy and beauty and wonder. Also, there's a lot of significant evidence that being in, on, around, and under the water is good for our mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical health. This is called the blue mind effect, blue mind impact. And so being close to the ocean, being in it, is good for us. And of course, we believe in a good God, and he made so much of the world water that it makes a whole lot of sense that being in the ocean is good for us. So we need to encourage people to connect with God, with each other, with the ocean, and with themselves through time spent in the water.
Blair Nelsen, Executive Director of WaterSpirit, a sponsored ministry of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Peace, who I also have the honor of representing at the United Nations. I am sharing these thoughts from the occupied Lenni Lenape land of the Navarumsunk Peninsula, also called Rumson, New Jersey, at the very northern end of the Jersey Shore. I have experienced God in many forms by walking down to the ocean's edge and allowing the immensity of presence to wash over me. A few summers ago, I was awed while watching juvenile humpbacks and bottlenose dolphins play in the waves near Sandy Hook Park, while the Manhattan skyline rose in the background. There is so much life all around us, all the time, and remembering that at the ocean's edge is both a comfort and a responsibility. In early November 2024, the day after we learned the outcome of the presidential election, I took my fear and rage down to the ocean's edge. The sun was gentle and brilliant on the water. Her vastness brought me back into awareness of all those things that are greater than myself and greater than these times. Stepping back into that awareness felt like the hand of God moving in my life. The ocean makes me think about Rudolf Otto's characterization of faith as the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, or fearful and fascinating mystery. There's certainly mystery to the ocean. We have seen less of the deep sea floor than we have seen of the surface of Mars. And there's a certain ambivalence in our relationship to the ocean as well. The ocean produces around half of the oxygen we breathe. It is a major source of food, livelihood, recreation, and joy for many people. But at the same time, the ocean can be fearsome in a storm, as the Jersey Shore knows well from Superstorm Sandy and other major weather disasters. In these times of fossil-fueled climate change, sea level rise, ocean warming, and ocean acidification are all proceeding at an alarming rate. In a way that's similar to our relationship to God, the ocean teaches us both how to love and surrender to something greater than ourselves, while needing to actively care for that greater power, even when our levers of impact can seem so small. Finally, the ocean teaches us about our interdependence. What happens in the ocean in one place has an impact everywhere. There are no borders there. I am intentionally using ocean in the singular to reflect the One Ocean movement at the United Nations and to reflect this interconnectedness. Similarly, the divine force that animates the universe interconnects us all. The ocean helps us touch that idea, to wrap our minds around it more easily. For Ocean Month, you might consider bringing in the wise fish of Job 12:8-10. Ask the plants of the earth, and they will teach you, and the fish of the sea will declare to you. Who among these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In his hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of every human being. We can use Job to invite people to reflect on the origin of our breath and the origin of life from both God and the sea. The declarative fish could be a pathway to thinking about other than human intelligences that are in constant communication with us, expanding our awareness of the wonders of creation. Returning to the idea of the ambivalence of the ocean, I can also suggest using Isaiah 43:2 this month. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. In a moment of rising authoritarianism in this country and a predicted more active than average hurricane season, parishioners might be particularly sensitive to the more overwhelming aspects of our relationship with the ocean. Isaiah 43:2 reassures us that even in the deepest and wildest waters, God is right there with us. Given my role as leader of WaterSpirit, an eco-spiritual ministry sponsored by a Catholic organization, I also lean on Pope Francis's environmental encyclicals quite a bit, and I recommend using those powerful words to inspire people beyond the Catholic tradition as well. For example, there is a powerful excerpt from Laudato Si 8, open quote. Patriarch Bartholomew has spoken in particular of the need for each of us to repent of the ways we have harmed the planet. For inasmuch as we all generate small ecological damage, we are called to acknowledge our contribution, smaller or greater, to the disfigurement and destruction of creation. He has repeatedly stated this firmly and persuasively. challenging us to acknowledge our sins against creation, for human beings to destroy the biological diversity of God's creation, for human beings to degrade the integrity of the earth by causing changes in its climate, by stripping the earth of its natural forests or destroying its wetlands, for human beings to contaminate the earth's waters, its land, its air, and its life. These are sins. For to commit a crime against the natural world is a sin against ourselves and a sin against God." End quote. Using this framework of ecological sin committed against water and the ocean helps us internalize the scale of this crisis and the urgency of action to protect this and future generations, and indeed our very souls. Laudato Si is a great source for learning about the urgency of ocean issues and how they relate to faith. That document, celebrating its 10th anniversary this year, discusses coral reef blanching, ocean warming, plastic pollution, and other water-related issues. It would make a welcome addition to any ocean sermon. There is never a bad time to preach about the ocean and to increase our ocean literacy. However, joining in the movement to promote ocean awareness during this June can contribute toward building critical mass toward ocean action. The ocean urgently needs protection. It's an all-hands-on-deck situation. Marine animals are facing immediate threats from illegal and unregulated fishing, ocean warming from fossil-fueled climate change, and large-scale pollution from plastics and other sources. The International Seabed Authority is also in the process of creating a set of regulations that would open the deep sea to untested deep sea mining technology, exposing ocean life and ocean-dependent coastal communities to unmitigated disaster. The UN Ocean Conference in Nice this June will be an excellent opportunity to push more countries toward passing a ban on deep sea mining to stop this dangerous practice before it begins. Most people aren't even aware of the looming threat of deep sea mining, and anyone with a platform has an urgent and unique opportunity to speak up for change right now. The UN Sustainable Development Goal that has to do with the ocean, SDG 14, is the most underfunded of all the goals. We can all do our part to tell our representatives that the ocean is critical to life itself and to push them to make large-scale change. Furthermore, the more aware our communities are about ocean issues, the more easily and delightedly we can take land-based actions that wind up protecting the ocean. Are you avoiding single-use plastic in your church events? Are you employing landscaping practices that keep pesticides out of our waterways? Are you doing everything you can to halt climate change in its tracks? These are all ocean actions within our immediate spheres of influence, and they are all critical at this moment in history. There is far more ocean than land on this great planet we call home. The writer Arthur C. Clarke once said, "How inappropriate it is to call this planet Earth when clearly it is ocean." Ocean awareness, ocean literacy, and ocean love should be an integral, not secondary aspect of our lives of faith. This is echoed by Pope Francis in Laudato Si 217, open quote. The ecological crisis is also a summons to profound interior conversion. Living our vocation to be protectors of God's handiwork is essential to a life of virtue. It is not an optional or a secondary aspect of our Christian experience. End quote. Pope Francis invites us all into an ecological conversion, and during this Ocean Month, I invite us to take that a step further. I invite us into an aquatic conversion, where our relationship with the source and sustainer of all life is enveloping our hearts and living in the forefront of our awareness. I hope we all experience this aquatic conversion this June. And one more thought to end on. I believe it is something special to note that Jesus' first disciples were fishermen. They were a people of the water, who knew the weather and the wildlife as surely as they knew their own selves. They were people of the Sea of Galilee, a freshwater inland sea, fed by the Jordan River, that became the site of many of Jesus' miracles. This is the place where Jesus walked on water, calmed the storm, fed thousands of people, and gave the Sermon on the Mount. As scholar Elizabeth McAnally shares in her book, Loving Water Across Religions, humans are like the ocean in our capacity for empathetic love. Water teaches us how to love, how to dissolve boundaries and flow into the feelings of another. We have the capacity to learn to love all things in the universe. Water is our guide. And I add to her thoughts, perhaps Jesus' teachings were ultimately teachings of love, because his relationship with the waters of Galilee made them so. We can become like them. We can become like those disciples, and we can let the ocean and our relationship with the water strengthen our faith and teach us such a divine love.
My name is Dan Vermeer. I'm an associate professor of the practice at the Fuqua School of Business at Duke University, and I also run the Center for Energy Development in the Global Environment called the EDGE Center. Summer is a great time to focus on oceans because it's part of our experience in the summer, typically more than it is the rest of the year. So people spend more time at the ocean on the coast. And so I think it's a good time to kind of help people frame that experience and go through that experience in a way that more tangibly connects their everyday, physical experience with the spiritual relevance of oceans. So first is just, I think the timing is really good to get in front of people around this issue. The second is that oceans make up 70% of the planet. And so the fact that we talk about creation and oceans are an afterthought is part of, I think, the distortion of us who have terrestrial minds, but pretty aquatic bodies. And interestingly, our bodies are made up of about the same percentage of water as what the planet is. So 70% of our bodies are also part of this. So we have oceans within us, just like we have oceans outside of us. And so I think making that connection between our bodies and oceans is really powerful. And the third thing I would say is that I think we have a misperception of oceans being limitlessly big and therefore able to absorb whatever pollution we put into it, and therefore also able to absorb any of the natural biodiversity that we take out of it. And I think we have now crossed that planetary boundary where we know those things are not true. And so it requires a rethinking of our intuitive stewardship of the ocean to really think harder about what it means to live in relation to a healthy, prosperous, bountiful ocean that does have limits, and we are approaching those limits. So our ethic of engagement needs to be rethought at this moment as well. Yeah, I think there's some really intriguing connections, and I do work also around what I call watershed spirituality. I just gave a talk on that topic. And so I think water themes are prominent and pervasive across the entire scripture, as you would expect an agrarian rooted gospel to be pretty sensitive to issues of water. But oceans specifically, I think let's start at the beginning. In the creation story, water isn't created the first day. Water actually precedes the creation. The oceans, or the great, yeah, the great formless state of the earth, uh, had waters, right? And so God's Spirit moved over the surface of the waters before God brought the creation to life. So there's something very primal and archetypal about oceans that it even precedes creation in the Christian creation story. So I think that's super provocative as we think about why it's significant and just how basic it is to what it means to be on the earth. So that's where I would start. Um, I also think that the story of Jonah is a story of not just the whale, but also about oceans and that sense of surrender and mercy and transformation that is possible. So the ocean provides not only a really powerful metaphorical basis for that, but actually, I think a physical embodiment of some of those values, some of those experiences of the moments of Christian life that Jonah sort of lived through in the vastness of the ocean, to be enveloped by it, to come to surrender to it, to accept that we're dependent on God's mercy in that great abyss, and that oceans are a place of potential dramatic, profound transformation. In Mark, there's also the story about Jesus calming the storm. And uh, I think what really is striking about that story is the kind of fear that the disciples had to be on the water in a little ship. And no matter how big your ship is, it's a little ship in relationship to the ocean. But they were on a little ship and they were filled with fear. And in preparation for this, I just started looking a little bit into it. Apparently, there are two different Greek words that are used for fear in that biblical version, that biblical story. One is delos, and the other is phobos. So one of those is about internal sense of fear. So the internal cowardice or timidity that the disciples displayed is something that keeps you from action. That's the delos part of the fear that's talked about here. But they also talk about phobos, which is a terror or awe that one experiences by something external. So it's not an internal experience. It's that feeling of awe that we have when we're confronted by God and by the power of creation. And so I thought it was kind of interesting that we only have one term, but the Greek has two terms to talk about the differentiation between the internal fear, which is that kind of cowardly response that the disciples had, but then this very other kind of fear, which is this kind of fear and trembling in front of God. And both of those are present in this story. So I think there's work that a minister could do to play out that, particularly in this moment, because I think fear is so much part of what we live and breathe in the environment that we're in right now. So giving people more language and more framework for understanding the types of fear that we experience and how we think about those in relationship to our spiritual life is a really powerful kind of place to take a message around the oceans. We get this Divers Action Network magazine, and it's hilarious because half of the magazine is you should go scuba diving. It's amazing. The other half is you can die in all kinds of ways by scuba diving. And I think that kind of sums up the way that you sort of approach the ocean with this sense of real fear about what the threats are. And
Yeah.
yet there is something incredibly powerful about being, 100 feet down in the ocean, absolutely dependent on these, little technologies that allow you to get to a place that nobody went before 1950. Uh, but to experience the peacefulness underneath the surface of the water, like no matter how wavy and chaotic it is on the surface, like it's interesting because even I'm sort of elaborating in lots of directions here, but even in my meditation, I have found that like the kind of the sinking into my kind of depth, I often think of that in ocean terms because I have
Mm.
such a sense of peacefulness that comes from that being enveloped in something so much greater than myself. So like even that kind of powerful sense of the blue light that you have at that is what I feel inside myself when I meditate. My brother was a marine biologist, and so from the earliest memories I have in rural Iowa, in the middle of the cornfields, was my brother with fish tanks all the way around our dining room with all these exotic species of fish from all over the world. So like he kind of created oceanic reality in the middle of the Midwest, which sort of frames some of my earliest memories. And that's all. He passed away early. He had a brain tumor and passed away in his early 50s. But my his whole life was about being near the water. He was trained as a marine biologist, lived in Florida, never cared about money, didn't care about most other people, just wanted to be on the ocean. And just some of my experiences with my brother, who was my kind of guide to the ocean. He lived on a Sapelo Island off the coast of Georgia, did his master's degree out there. That was the first time I really spent any time at the ocean, and it was in this pretty isolated place. And he did research on hermit crabs, so he was like giving me sort of like an orientation to this whole world that I never knew before. And so super powerful just in terms of my ability to experience the richness of God's creation. That really came through in that experience. I remember one time he took me out on his boat. We went out to a site where there was a shipwreck that was in, I bet it was probably 50 feet of water. And I jumped in and kind of looked underneath the surface to see the ship. He jumped in without a mask or a tank, went all the way down to the ship, entered in its broken open side, swam through this like 70-foot boat, and then came out the other side and swam back to the surface. Meanwhile, like I got like 8 feet down and my head is, pressure. I can't get any deeper than that. It's like, oh my God, amazing. So like I was just so taken by his ability to navigate in that universe I didn't know anything about. Um, so and then I'll give you a more recent experience that I just found really magical. My daughter and I went to dive on the Great Barrier Reef. She was studying in Australia, so I'm like, if I'm going to Australia, we're definitely going to the reef. And we stayed on an island called Lady Elliot, which was the southernmost island on the Great Barrier Reef chain, and spent about 4 days out there, and dived and snorkeled the whole time we were out there. While we were there, I think it was on the second night we were there, we were in our cabin and we heard this tonk, tonk against the side of the house. Like, what in the world is going on? So we went outside and there were two mama turtles that had come up out of the ocean, had come up to our cabin. One was trying to get underneath the cabin, and that's what the sound was that we were hearing. It was flap using its flipper to hit the side of it. It eventually gave up and turned around and went back in the ocean. But the second one came up and decided to create its nest right at the edge of our stairs. And so the turtle got there, began to move the sand away, and then kind of a little bit deeper indent, about 2 feet down. This unfolded over the course of about an hour and a half. And then she kind of settled down in, and they go into a kind of a trance state when they're laying the eggs. So, kind of not really conscious of what's around them. You can actually get close to them at that phase because they're not paying any attention. They have more important things to do. She laid her eggs, and then once she came out of that, then she used her flippers, kind of pulled all the sand into the hole again, smoothed it out so you couldn't even really tell that there was a nest there, and then worked her way back out into the ocean. So this whole thing took like an hour and a half, and it was absolutely magical to see this, to be the only ones there. She came to us, essentially to go through what felt like a really sacred ritual, frankly. I mean, it just like I really had a strong sense of like, what a magical thing we're seeing here, like this act of creation that is happening right at our stairs. So I was just super moved by that experience. To experience it with my daughter and to see this whole thing from the beginning to the end was just pretty amazing. That's where I feel like my most recent experience of that sense of awe and gratitude for the richness of the ocean and of biodiversity really played out. The addendum to that is, we're out there, the coral reefs had been hit pretty hard the previous year, but had recovered quite a bit. So they were in good shape when we were there. But 93% of the world's coral reefs got bleached in this last phase, which is just stunning. I mean, I really think we are seeing the the dying out of the most biodiverse um, you know, locations on the planet in our lifetimes.
Yeah.
So that hits really hard too, that these places are so rich and full of life, and we're systematically, though indirectly, exterminating them.
Yeah.
And the chances that my kids will be able to take their kids to see this is pretty minimal. So, Blue Mind is a concept popularized by Wallace Nichols in his book called Blue Mind. And essentially, the idea is there is a number of documented health and psychological positive benefits for being on or in or near water. And so, a lot of the research shows that people's experiences of whether it's swimming or it's being near the water or diving, experiences that bring them close to water have all kinds of positive benefits in terms of stress reduction, in terms of reduction of anxiety and sense in as well as the positive emotions, things like connection to nature and sort of positivity and sort of being in touch with their bodies, like all these kind of positive impacts that come from that experience. So I actually have thought it would be really cool to get Duke's medical system engaged as being a place that really innovated around blue mind complementary modalities of treatment that could be incorporated
Mm.
into the broader kind of portfolio of medical treatment. So I think I'm not quite sure what to play out there other than that I think oceans remind us of just psychologically that we have this sort of need for restoration that I think the oceans not only symbolically represent, but physically provide to us. And that idea of blue mind, I think, is a really powerful way to say it's like, it's not that people just sort of like metaphorically are thinking spiritual thoughts at the ocean. It's like there's actually something about that experience that psychologically we are built for a kind of process of restoration that happens in relationship to water. So I
Mm.
think that's really powerful. So that's the first. The second is, I don't know if you've been following this at all, but there's a great TikTok story that's unfolding, which is this guy, Oliver, who uh, decided to quit his meaningless job and sail across the world.
Oh.
And, and he and his cat. So he's like a 25-year-old guy, and he sold everything. He cashed in his 401k, bought a boat, and set sail from San Diego and started doing TikTok videos every day, just like, this everyday guy say, Oliver, my name is Oliver, and I'm trying to sail across the ocean with my cat. And it was it attracted a cult following. There's all these people like, oh my God, this guy is amazing. Um, and he just arrived in Hawaii. So I just saw the video like
Oh, wow.
24 days later. There were some sketchy moments, like some of the days he reported, like it was not clear he was going to make it.
Mm.
But super fascinating. And I think it's a great story about the everyday person who takes a big risk by trusting themselves to the ocean, like throwing themselves out into the unknown in a way with very much not adequate support or protection for what they were setting out to do that I think is really powerful. And, I think the religious messages about walking by faith, not by sight, sailing out into the deep water. I think there's a real kind of metaphor there that's really powerful. And Oliver would be a great way to frame that up, I think. And I also think there's a kind of sense of humility that he portrays really well in that you aren't in control of a lot of things that happen to you there. And so I think it really brings to light that we're all sailing on an unknown sea, even if we never get on the water, right? And so
Yeah.
there's so much that we don't understand about that. And I guess the third point of reference I would make is I found we have a cabin up in the mountains in North Carolina, and the hurricane Helene that went through in September was really just mind-bending in the power of water and of oceans and experiences of hurricanes that were always coastal, which now are not just coastal.
Yeah.
So I think we're also seeing the transformation of the climate system that oceans are central to. This is a whole nother kind of thing that we could talk about, but one of the reasons that I fairly late in life fell in love with oceans is I've been working on climate for a long time, and then it occurred to me that I was thinking about climate in a way that put oceans on the periphery or maybe not in the view at all. And what I suddenly dawned on me was that oceans actually are the engine that drives the whole thing. It's where all of the, 90+% of all the carbon is actually in the ocean. It's not in the atmosphere.
Hmm.
90% um, of the heat is not experienced in the atmosphere. It's actually embedded in the ocean. And thank God it has the ability to absorb as much heat as it has, or we all would have been fried long ago.
Yeah.
But I heard a talk recently that compared the impact of the excess heat from human activity on the planet being equivalent to, I've heard two numbers, either 5 or 10 nuclear bombs per second in the ocean. And
Wow.
so this is every second of every day of every year forever, as far as the eye can see, of essentially exploding multiple nuclear bombs every day, every moment, every second. And so the intense damage that accumulates over time, even in something as vast as the ocean, is, um, I mean, just to me, really mind-bending. So I think when I give a talk on oceans, I always end with this idea of the overview effect. Said, when astronauts went out in space and they looked down on the planet, a lot of them reported a really transformative experience where they suddenly saw this fragile blue marble that was vulnerable, that was exquisitely beautiful, in which all of the boundaries and all the divisions that we see on the planet don't exist when you see it from afar, right? And so that was like a spiritual experience to have this overview effect. And I almost feel like I've had that experience with the ocean,
Mm.
that suddenly I began to see the world through the lens of the oceans instead of seeing the oceans as the periphery of the land. And
Mm.
that's made a huge difference in my sensitivity to some of the messages and some of the kind of arenas of action around this that I think are, for me, have been quite transformative. So I guess that my last point is I think we need a kind of overview effect of the oceans
Mhm.
um, if we're going to really center some of these things that we have really marginalized up till now.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Green Lectionary Podcast. Be sure to join us next week for part 2 of Preaching for Ocean Month. This episode was produced by Derek Weston, and the music was provided by Christian McIver. You can support this and other programs of Creation Justice Ministries at creationjustice.org/donate.